Mommy, it's that man again from Mtg. We like it a magic, and y'all, we just had our first big tournament of Lost Caverns of Ixalan Standard. And yeah, we had a couple of MTGO challenges here and there, but that was about it. Until this weekend, when Big Magic hosted the Aichi Open in Japan, and nearly 500 players attended. And not just any local yokels either. I really want to take a second to point out the field here because it reads like an all-star roster from the Japanese scene, you know. Yuyun Kim, Takashi Fuji, Ken Yukihiro, Saito was there, Kazuhiro Suzuki, and all these people are just in the top 8. A lot of the brightest minds in the Japanese scene came to play at this tournament, and there's a lot of professional experience, again, just within the top 8 or 16 here. So that's kind of exciting, but you know what else is? New decks, right? This tournament ended up challenging some of the perceptions that we may have had over the first couple of weeks of Ixalan Standard. Now, in all those MTGO challenges and league results that we've gotten to see up to now, aggro was dominating the field, right? The Azorius Soldiers deck, the Mono White Humans deck, Mono Red aggro, and it's not really a surprise, I want to point out for the 1000th time in case you haven't heard me give this explanation. First couple of weeks of a new standard, people are feeling things out. Mid-range and control decks and other decks like those decks are trying to figure out how to use their slots most effectively, and in the meantime, fastest deck tends to win. So again, it's no real surprise to see aggro dominate the early days of a format, but now we get to see mid-range strike back a little bit, figure out how to counter these aggro strategies most effectively, and for the most part, that was the story of this tournament. Now, I admit there are a bunch of cool-looking decks on screen right now that I could click on to kind of start things off for real here, but the deck I'm going to click on first is one that I feel like most exemplifies the sort of mid-range dominance at this tournament, and it's also maybe the second or even first most successful deck from the early days of Standard. Sure, there were the aforementioned aggro decks that did very well in those challenges, but you could also say, arguably, the most successful deck of the early days was Azorius midrange, and it was able to hold on in this tournament and get multiple spots in the top 8. Now, normally, I'll give it to you, Azorius midrange kind of sounds like a boring deck to discuss to a lot of people, but the Azorius midrange decks at this tournament, especially and even in the top 8, are kind of interesting in the way they use their slots. Now, all that said, this list right here by Masashiro Kuroda is not only the most successful of the Azorius midrange decks, but it is also the most quote-unquote normal of the Azorius midrange decks, in big ol' air quotes, no shade, that is in no way an insult. I think you'll know what I mean when we get to a couple of the other Azorius midrange decks. They do have very flexible slots. A little bit of foreshadowing on what we're going to talk about when we look at these other lists, but again, this one is more or less what we saw a lot of over the course of these challenges, right? The big cards in here are the Subterranean Schooner, maybe the biggest breakout kind of sleeper card from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. Really good with a lot of stuff in not only this deck, but also the Esper Legends deck, or just the Esper midrange deck mostly. That also made the top 8, which again is really no surprise, right? But the Azorius deck still gets to play the Dennick that you're used to, right? It gets Tishana's Tidebinder, which is another one of the hotter new cards from Lost Caverns of Ixalan for a reason, you know, a counterspell on a body, effectively a counterspell for activated abilities and triggers and stuff. So that is often game-winning because it has so many ridiculous targets in Standard. But the deck also plays Spyglass Siren, so there's a fair number of new cards from LCI. This is just a 1-mana 1/1 flyer that gives you a map when it ETBs. But it also crews the Schooner, and that means it can draw you lands or get bigger and start attacking too. And the Dennick can crew the Schooner and maybe get bigger and become a 3/4 lifelink. That's really good against aggro decks and stuff. So there's a lot of cool things about this deck. It can play at sort of a tempo-y pace with the Tidebinder and the Wandering Emperor, or it can actually get out on board. If it gets its Dennick against aggro, it's in position pretty well. It's got a turn 1 play in Spyglass Siren. It's got Virtue of Loyalty, so along with the Wandering Emperor and the Wedding Announcement that are in the deck, right, then suddenly you can just kind of wait things out. In the later game, you've got a bunch of tokens that are all getting bigger and bigger as turns go on, and of course, you've also got a counterspell. A lot of these things kind of tie all of the blue-white aggro or mid-range decks together in this format, right? A counterspell. Wedding Announcement, a little bit of Virtue of Loyalty, definitely Subterranean Schooner, right? Most of them played Dennick, Tishana's Tidebinder, Spyglass Siren, Wandering Emperor. In this case, Masashiro just played all of these cards and did not make room for funky like 2-ofs like we'll see in a couple of these other decks. This is just, again, the rote version of this deck, and it's probably the one that I would suggest you play if you're going to try it out. But just to kind of showcase the difference in some of these deck lists and how flexible the slots are in Azorius midrange right now, and you can still placed. This deck's still top 8'd. Let's take a look at Genyukahiro's list. Now, you'll notice this deck also plays the Wandering Emperor, plays Spyglass Siren, Tishana's Tidebinder, Subterranean Schooner, a counterspell and Make Disappear, some Virtue of Loyalty. So, again, a lot of the slots are like fairly similar, right? The core is there, but they use flex slots in interesting ways, right? Like, Ken's got a Cathar Commando in there, pretty sweet little card for busting up other Subterranean Schooners and important stuff like that. Wedding Announcements and stuff too, right? Miner's Guidewing is in here, just a 1-mana 1/1 Vigilance flying bird guy that when it dies, the thing you control explores. Interesting include. Playing a Werefox Bodyguard, sort of a brutal Cathar that you can play at, flash speed. So again, this deck can be like tempo-y. It's got Fairy Mastermind, Werefox Bodyguard, Wandering Emperor, Tishana's Tidebinder, and of course, Errant and Giada as well. And it casts basically the entire deck, off the top of your library. So really interesting sort of build. They leaned way more into the tempo-y aspect of this deck. And again, top 8'd. So in some ways, it's a different deck than the Azorius mid-range decks. It really is. It doesn't play quite as often at sorcery speed or anything. There's no Wedding Announcement in this deck, as you may notice, right? Doesn't lean so much into the sort of tokensy theme and late game sort of get a bunch of guys on the board, Wedding Announcement turns over, and you just swing for alpha. This deck is trying to, again, establish a little bit more tempo in the mid-game and blow out big plays and stuff like that. So, again, sort of a different attack plan for a deck like this, but still Azorius mid-range at its heart and doing a lot of cool work. And again, playing a lot of the same cards, but a different game plan mostly. But let's look at another one if you'll allow me to. This is Iori Kusunoki's list, and it plays again. Wandering Emperor, Spyglass Siren. You got Dinnick in this list. It wasn't in the last one. 2 Tishana's Tidebinder, Subterranean Scooter, Wedding Festivity, and Announcement is in this one, right? A Counterspell and Make Disappear, but not a 4 of. A whole 4 Virtue of Loyalty, right? So again, fudging with the numbers, but still playing the core here. But how did we use our flex slots, right? There's a Hopeful Initiator too in this one. Yeah, I haven't seen too much of that lately at all in Standard. An Overcharged Amalgam, just a single copy of Overcharged Amalgam, leaning a little bit more again into that tempo-y plan, but not really, and not as much as the last deck we saw at all, or even honestly as much as the first deck that we saw. This deck only plays the 2 Tidebinder, doesn't play anything like Werefox Bodyguard or any flash creatures aside from a couple, right? So, the Tidebinder mostly. So, but it does have Overcharged Amalgam in it as kind of a counterspell on a body that also flies. I mean, I've always liked this guy, and you should have things to exploit to it if you have a Wedding Announcement in play and stuff. So a neat little include here, and I bet it can turn the tide of a lot of games. Plus Unctus, probably the weirdest include in the deck, right? But it can draw you a ton of cards. You have to discard some cards, but draw you a bunch of cards too. And of course, other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1. What does that do in this deck? Subterranean Schooner, I guess. So that's kind of neat, right? But just a neat little include, This deck has so many flexible slots, it can actually fit a 2 of Unctus and still top 8. But let's take a quick look at the sort of big brother of Azorius midrange in this format, and that's Esper midrange. These decks are actually fairly similar, so I wanted to feature them back to back. And Esper actually got back to back too, both 6th and 7th place in this tournament. And they play a lot of the same cards. Again, I can just point out Wandering Emperors in here, Dinnick's in this list. You got Wedding Announcements, some Virtue of Loyalty, a counterspell like Make Disappear. In this deck, you get access to removal like Go for the Throat and Cut Down and stuff, so that's not uncommon to see. Only a couple of Schooner in the list, but it's still here, right? Rafine and Deep Cavern Bat, a brand new card from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, can both crew the Schooner pretty well. If you can explore with the bat off the Schooner, then sometimes it becomes a 2/2 or even a 3/3 lifelink. You start getting in with it. That's pretty good. Great against aggro. And sometimes it just draws you cards too. It just draws you lands, and you need those in a deck like this. So got to have your drops mostly. So this deck is mostly going to use, the swamps that it adds to the deck to play Rafine in the main deck. But it is cool that it gets Deep Cavern Bat, gets to leverage that to get important cards out of the opponent's hand and stuff too, like Sunfall and just basically removal and big plays aggro wants to make or whatever. So you also get, I was going to say Lord Skitter. It's in the deck too, but Urtai Resurrected, just a 1 of. Sometimes you'll see a 2 of, but not usually more than that in a deck like this. Just a little bit like Overcharged Amalgam in the last deck that we looked at, right? Just kind of the same basic play pattern, but in a lot of ways, this is the same deck as the Azorius decks. They just get to play Rafine. And this, much like one of the last Azorius decks we looked at, really the first Azorius deck we looked at, is the kind of basic version of Esper. There's a bunch of different ways to build this deck, but this is one of the lists that you kind of see the most often. It's the quote-unquote safe list in this format, but we did get to see an Esper list that looked really interesting in a number of cool ways, right? Like we got to see, again, Wandering Emperor, Rafine, Deep Cavern Bat, Dinnick, they're all in here. 2 Urtai, like I was saying, sometimes you see 2. Subterranean Schooner, right? But this one uses a flex slot for Oherpak Padik. This is really, really neat in this deck. This is the one that gives instance rebound. So kind of neat that you can like double cut down or double go for the throat or double get lost something. Just really, really sweet sort of application on the card. In the meantime, it's a 4/3 flyer too. So really, really cool application. The deck does play 2 Plaza of Heroes, as you see over here. Behind my head to kind of help. This isn't quite Esper Legends. I wouldn't go so far as to call it that, but it can leverage Plaza of Heroes to protect things like Oherpak Padik and Rafine and Dinnick when it needs to. So again, not too far off from sort of, again, a normal sort of safe Esper list, but neat to see the inclusion of Oherpak Padik in here. Now, in other news, Hirotaka Kawasaki came with a deck that we've seen before, but a different version of it, which again, I think is cool when we do see evolution in existing deck types. We see a bunch of new cards, and that's what we got to see from this version of Mono White Control, right? You got Wandering Emperor's in there. We've seen it in every deck so far. It's should tell you something. Eternal Wanderer is also in here. Not uncommon to see the 2 of in this deck. An Elspeth Resplendent to get important like permanent types on the field, and that +1 is actually busted in practice if you've ever actually used it. It's really, really good. But there's also Ambitious Farmhand. Not uncommon to see in the deck. Lorna the Third Path in the main deck makes plenty of sense, especially in this format with Schooner basically everywhere, and a bunch of other cards too. But this is where things diverge, apart from, I guess, the Wedding Festivity and the Ossification. There's Lay Down Arms, right? There's Sunfall, these removal pieces. I believe there's even some Get Lost, yeah. Get Lost is, I guess, a new card, but you would expect it to be in here. Aside from that, kind of some interesting card choices, though. Sarah Paragon is in here. Again, not super uncommon to see this, but the full 3 of in the main deck is a little more rare to come across. But they're really leaning on this to get back some important stuff. Can't obviously reanimate any Planeswalkers, but just about everything else in the deck it can bring back. And also note that just about everything else in the deck has a relevant ETB trigger, including Guardian of Girapur, which can also sort of kind of, definitely blink stuff. Sarah Paragon doesn't blink stuff, but I guess with both of these, my point is that you can repeat enter the battlefield triggers. And that's really important too for a lot of the stuff that we're playing with. So really, really neat. Note too that Guardian of Girapur can blink a Might Stone and Weak Stone, which we're playing 2 of in this deck, and I think it's pretty cool. Drawing 2 cards in mono white is great, but so is the removal card on this. But Realm Breakers in here if we want to kind of mill them to death and also like ramp with their lands, which can be really cool some of the time too. So always like to see the 1 of Realm Breaker. Again, you see this sometimes, but not all the time. It's nice to see the version that does play the singleton Realm Breaker actually kind of start breaking through and getting a good result. But there's also Clay Fired Bricks in here, which can also give you Cosmium Kiln, which is a neat little card, but Clay Fired Bricks is kind of good by itself. That said, Kiln is kind of another copy of Wedding Announcement once you have enough mana, and that's really sweet. Candy Trail is also in here. Really, really neat card to include. The Scry 2 is almost a drawn card in a deck like this, and gain 3 life, draw a card, right? So you can just return this with Sarah Paragon every turn, or not every turn, but at least once, if you've got nothing else to do that turn. And gain 3, draw a card, which can sometimes be like the best thing you can do, even if you have other options. So really like that include in this deck too. And it also like crafts with Clay Fired Bricks in the late game if you needed to, with no real consequence to your board state. So that's a good little use for it. A lot of cool stuff going on in this version of Mono White that we haven't really seen before, and I respect that. But up next is Akira Sasaki, who helped to legitimize a deck that's been popular so far in the early season in these challenges and leagues and stuff, but really helped to prove that it's got legs by top 8ing with it here in this tournament. It's Boros Aggro, the version that plays an Impikal, 1000th Moon. Now, the version that plays like Imidane's Recruiter and Knight Errant of Eos, sort of at the top end, also showed up at this tournament, but I think notably this deck did a little bit better than it. Not that it means anything, it's one tournament. It's a very small sample size, right? But I do think it's worth noting that this deck can at least hang with other decks in this environment, including a deck that's very similar to it, already established, people know the play patterns and all that. So I think it's cool that an Impakal is actually doing stuff, especially with a deck that's so set up to kind of take advantage of her. We've got other new cards like NT in here, which actually combos really well with an Impakal. In case you wanted to know, it's really, really sweet combination there. But there's also Kellen Daring Traveler, which kind of makes the deck Naya. If you want to cast Journey on, you can. There's green in the mana base, so it's called Boros, but I guess you technically, if you wanted to be weird, semantic, you could call it Naya just because of that. But Kellen, it turns out the creature half is a neat enough card when, all the creatures in our deck basically fulfill the condition on the attacks trigger. So really sweet card there too. But, Coppercoat Vanguard's in here because our dudes are humans. Thalia, it's a Thalia deck, it turns out. Recruitment Officer's in here is one of our best one-drops we could possibly play, but Hopeful Initiate gets bigger and helps us, actually interact with our opponent's permanents too. So Brutal Cathar, the same. Can flip over and get bigger, but also interacts with stuff. So we have removal here without having to play removal. But we do have 4 Get Lost. Even in a Thalia deck, I think it's worth playing 4 of these. This is probably the right call. Hopefully we're so aggro that we kill our opponent before they can even really take advantage of the map tokens, so good kind of deck for this card. But there's also Lunarch Veteran as just a 2 of against the aggro decks in the format. So pretty straightforward deck, plays mostly 3 and 4 ofs, but it's also pretty well thought out in terms of what you have to do in this meta right now. So I like the list. I actually want to issue a quick in-video correction. I said that Boros aggro top 8'd back there. At least I believe that I did, if I remember correctly. It actually got 9th place, just barely out of the top 8. Kind of heartbreaking, but still a really good finish for Suzaki here. Great looking deck here is all I want to say. But here's the Boros Convoke deck here in number 11. This is the one that you're kind of more used to with Imidane's Recruiter, Knight Errant of Eos. It did add Sanguine Evangelist to the deck, but not a whole lot more. So I want to move on and look at some other decks. We could look at Domain Ramp, but you know what Domain Ramp looks like. I think the real story here is that Domain Ramp ended up not top 8ing, right? It turns out that Ramp hadn't been too popular in the early days of the format because aggro had kind of established its foothold, and Ramp isn't very good against decks that went on turn 4 traditionally. So Ramp has been kind of kicked out of the format for a week and a half effectively, and we see that trend kind of continuing even as the mid-range decks start to creep back into dominance, right? So I kind of like that trend. If nothing else, I'm a little sick of the Atraxa decks. But with all that said, let's move on to some of the more interesting decks of this event, starting with Bant Toxic, which doesn't seem like it would be super interesting. I think we've all seen Bant Toxic before. This one by Takashi Fuji, a very well-known player here in the Japanese scene, and for a reason, a very good player as well. But this is a neat little deck. This is, plays 4 Skrelv like you would expect, 4 Venerated Rot Priest, 4 Jawbone Duelist, 4 Crawling Chorus, 4 NX Sentry, 3 Skrells High, 4 Experimental Augury, which I actually think is a neat little pick. And then it's got some picks that kind of establish it as a hybrid between the tempo deck and the aggro deck, right? The aggro deck is going to play cards like Jawbone Duelist, Annex Sentry to get the opponent's creatures off the board so it can attack, but still also provides the deck an attacker. Very important cards for the aggro deck to play, especially Jawbone Duelist, Skrelv's Hive a lot of the time too, to make sure you can keep board presence up, even if you get swept. So very sort of aggro-oriented philosophy on the deck's face, but it also plays a few hits from the, Simic Rot Priest deck that's more of a combo deck than an aggro deck. The Simic Rot Priest deck barely even attacks, ever. It just wins the game. But, we poured over some pieces like Fading Hope, obviously, gives us an interactive piece that we can also target a Rot Priest with. Save it while also giving them poison counters. March of Swirling Mist, again, a tempo piece we can get in with attackers. We can keep our opponent from attacking. We can target our own Rot Priest with this and get poison counters and stuff, our own creatures with this, and give the opponent poison counters if we have a Rot Priest in play. But also Serum Snare is in the deck. Yet another sort of Fading Hope type effect that will proliferate in this case. So really amazing to have that too in this deck. It's surprising that you don't see this all the time in the Simic versions of the deck, but we're seeing it here. But also Experimental Augury, which I thought was kind of an interesting include, right? We're kind of an aggro deck, but again, this not necessarily puts us in the realm of a tempo deck, not necessarily that, but it does give us a kind of mid-game piece. Once pieces are in place, our opponent has a few poison counters, and we're looking for the knockout punch. We're looking for the March of Swirling Mist to target 3 of our guys and finish the game off. This will help us do that. It assumes that the deck will not always be in a position to win the game on turn 4. And I kind of think that's an interesting include in a deck like this. But that's all I really have to say. I feel like we've seen not only the green-white one and the blue-green one, but we've seen the Bant version of this deck before. The most important thing to note about this deck is that it top 8'd it all. Matter of fact, it made it all the way to the finals, so maybe be prepared for this deck right now. It might be in a unique position in the current environment to not only combat other aggro decks, but also kind of get underneath all the mid-range decks while, not only counting on its creatures to attack the way aggro does. I think right now against mid-range decks and even the control decks in the environment, aggro's in this kind of position to where, or rather toxic is in a kind of position to where, no, I should say aggro. Let me start this with aggro. Aggro's in a position to where it has to keep attacking, and mid-range is going to put it in a position where it can no longer attack, and it has to find the reach in some way or another. Whereas this deck can attack in the opening turns of the game, give the opponent some poison counters, put like 6 on them real quick. And then if it does get in a position where the opponent stops its attack, or even if the opponent wipes its creatures, it can still put poison on them. You either draw your one Venerated Raw Priest and you target it with March or another creature with March. And get some poison that way. Or you Serum, Snare, Experiment, or Augury and get the last couple of poison on them that way. So really interesting kind of forms of reach for an aggro deck to have, and it might, again, put it in a better position against the mid-range decks in the format than a lot of the other aggro decks have right now. But let's look at the last deck I want to look at in this video, and it's the deck that won the whole tournament. We and Kim brought all other deck lists to that. That's how you beat all the other decks, is that you just bring all other deck lists to the tournament. You've probably been itching to know what this is if you can read it on your screen. If you're watching on your TV, which I watch YouTube on my TV, if you're watching on your laptop or your notepad, maybe you can see it. But if you're watching on your phone, I bet you cannot read that. But one way or the other, we actually ended up bringing a sort of Bant control ramp up the beanstalk. There's actually not ramp in this deck, so it's actually kind of a Bant control deck. Really interesting call for this tournament too, right? Because I think a lot of people made this sort of paper, rock, scissors call that aggro is so popular in the early game that there's going to be a lot of aggro at this open. So the best thing to do is to bring mid-range, okay, to beat the aggro decks. Well, I guess the idea in Kim's mind was, if a lot of people are going to be bringing mid-range decks to beat the aggro decks, we're going to bring a control deck to beat the mid-range decks. And maybe it worked out. Because this deck is really interesting. It plays some of the stuff we've seen already today, like the Wandering Emperor. We've already seen Sunfall in some decks, but not as a 4 of yet. The counterspell of choice here is not Make Disappear. Notably, it's Syncopate. This deck looks to go much later into the game than some of the mid-range aggro hybrids like we've seen, Azorius and Esper and stuff. Those decks are going to close out the game, fairly reliably. They put a clock on the opponent. They have bodies and stuff. But this deck, we're going to go a little bit later. So I like the idea of playing Syncopate here as a much later game counterspell and more reliable than a card like Make Disappear. This deck also plays Get Lost. I was talking about how good this is in aggro decks that are, again, going to close the door on the game like quickly and not give your opponent the chance to really do stuff with these map tokens. But this deck also plays 4 Sunfall and 4 Laydown Arms. So yeah, you might utilize the 2 map tokens, but they're probably not going to give you that much value in the end because there's so much ridiculous removal in the deck. Like March of Otherworldly Light, which can take out a bunch of important permanent types, a good spread of stuff you can deal with on March, and I like that too. But we got Leyline Binding along with the Sunfall to lay down arms and stuff. So the deck is going to draw cards with like Celestis, and Silver Scrutiny. It's going to leverage that card advantage by wiping every single thing that you have on the table. And again, against a lot of these mid-range decks in the format, that shouldn't be too difficult a situation to engineer for a control deck, because a lot of the mid-range decks are going to rely on a couple of big threats to kind of carry them through, So I think resolving a Sunfall and then kind of protecting your board state is a pretty good plan at this point in Standard, and it's not super surprising to see a control deck win. There are some cool slots in here, like Horned Lock Whale, which is a card that I've liked since the first time we saw it in Throne preview season, It's got a little removal spell on it. You want removal in this deck, but it's also got a big guy. Big guy with flash, hard to target and stuff, and I like that. It's just a way to win the game. They can also win the game with Wandering Emperor, but maybe the coolest thing in here is the Nissa Ascended Animus. It cost a lot to play, but in the late game, you might have the life to just help play it, or you might have the lands to just play the thing and just win the game on the spot. It can also destroy artifacts or enchantments for a really nominal fee. It can help you sort of reestablish board position or just like become the monster, get in the driver's seat by making huge creatures. Or again, you can just win the game. You just drop it and win the game out of nowhere. You know, Crater Hoof Behemoth kind of mode on this card, so an overrun mode at the very least. So really sweet card to include just a one of. If you draw it late when you've sort of established control, then you are kind of putting a clock on the opponent, and that clock could just be like that turn, you know. But if nothing else, you're making huge guys, and they have to respond to that, and suddenly they're on their back foot, and what are they going to do? So again, I really like the inclusion of Nissa as just this massive bomb you can toss at the end of the game and just like dare them to answer it. But aside from that, Up the Beanstalk is really the sauce in this deck. This is, you know, not necessarily the key card in the deck, but it's one of the things that's going to keep us drawing cards, and it gives us a 2-mana play and stuff too in certain matchups. So, you know, just a really well-crafted sort of Bant control list here that plays the 26 lands you want to play in a deck like this. Sideboard includes the Chrome Host Seed Shark you might expect, but some other stuff you might not expect, like Obstinate Baloth, right? So just a really neat little list, and I'm not surprised necessarily that it got first place, but I have to be a little surprised because this is not necessarily a deck that's existed in Standard up to this point at this point in the season, right? I mean, maybe Up the Beanstalk decks existed at the end of last season, but they've been relatively quiet. And again, it's important to point out this is not a ramp deck like most Up the Beanstalk decks. This is more or less a pure control deck up and down the line. And it's scary to see those win a whole tournament, the first big tournament of the season with 500 entrants. But you got to understand why it wins to combat it. And I think it's pretty easy to figure it out. If mid-range is going to be the dominant force in the format, control can establish a foothold. And then we get into the glorious sort of paper, rock, scissors that used to define old Standard. Is aggro going to win this week? Is mid-range going to win this week? Is control going to win this week? It all kind of depends on how people can respond to the meta and how decks evolve over time. And that's actually one of the best things about Standard. And we've got a couple of months till the next set comes out still to sort of keep growing that Standard in the direction that we want. So I think Standard's actually looking like it's in an interesting position. Maybe we need to continue to figure out how to combat these Azorius decks. I will say that Azorius and Esper do look like the biggest boogeymen in Standard right now. And I'm not going to deny that. But when we see decks like Bant and, you know, actually both Bant decks in the finals, that's kind of amazing. But, you know, we see Bant Beanstalk and Bant Toxic. Leapfrog decks like Esper and Azorius aggro to become not necessarily brand new, right? But unexpected sort of underdog heroes in the new format. It's kind of an interesting story, right? So just goes to show you that even if decks like Azorius and Esper look dominant, or Domain Ramp looked dominant a month ago, there's always going to be new things that we can try. You know, despite whether it's new cards or shifts in the meta, there's always going to be stuff that we can try that can become better than it once was, or just this brand new deck. So, you know, we got to see that with the Boros aggro deck with an Impakal. Just there's new decks, there's old decks, and, you know, just a fairly healthy looking Standard here, especially again if we can more solve the Azorius quote unquote problem, if you can even call it that. But it does look like blue-white is the strongest color pair to play in Standard right now, and that's kind of hard to deny given the top 8. So again, not all the kinks are worked out here. I'm not going to pretend they are, but this is a cooler looking Standard to me than it's been in a good long time, and I think that does mean something. I guess most importantly to note, and finally I'll note, that Standard is progressing at the rate and in the way that we expected to. And to some people that's going to be boring, but in my opinion, it hasn't done that in too long, I guess, is my point, right? We've seen the same decks at the top of Standard for a good long time now, and each new set that comes out doesn't create this rock, paper, scissors cycle of aggro, fastest deck wins, and mid-range comes in, and then control does the thing. You know, we haven't really seen that very often lately. It's just been the same decks that we saw last season are doing the thing. So I think it's good to see that sort of basic cycle of growth and renewal start up again. You know, it's a little bit of hope, a glimmer of hope in Standard, and allow me that, and allow me to pitch you the idea as well. So, you know, open your heart is all I mean. But in any case, I think I've taken enough of your time at this point. This video is probably very long. I thought I was just going to get on here and talk about like 3 or 4 decks, but no, let's just talk about the entire tournament, whatnot. But hope you enjoyed the sort of breakdown. Let me know if there's anything that I sort of missed in the metagame analysis. I'm sure there is, but, you know, I'm always interested to hear it. And if there's any ways you know of solving sort of the problems that are left in Standard, let me know. Outside of like design flaws, like ways we can use the cards we have access to combat Azorius and stuff, let me know down there in the comments. But that's about all I got for this one. So just do YouTube stuff on your way out. Hit the like before you hit the lights. You can also check out the subscribe button. I hear it's nice this time of year. If you haven't hit it yet, I'll also hear that it makes like a little fireworks thing if you hit it nowadays, so test that out. It probably looks cool. Hit the bell for the notifications if you want to. Sure, it seems like that'd be good. And then check me out on twitch.tv/SBMTGDev, where we play Magic. It's a good place to play Magic, I hear. I have fun. Aside from that, check out the Patreon, just $1 a month to support the content and reward me for the in-depth metagame analyses and all that stuff. It's Christmas month, so really, really helps out when you join the Patreon. It means a lot to me as well, because I really couldn't live my life without it. So thanks all current patrons and all future patrons as well. Shout out to you. You're awesome. But aside from that, I'm basically done talking. Can you imagine? I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.